Welcome back to Animal Encounters. Today we are looking at 7 deadly encounters where exotic pets turned on the people who kept them. From a captive reticulated python that had been fed by the same hands for over a decade on the island of Sulawesi, to an African leopard that turned on its primary handler at a breeding facility in South Africa during a window of risk that had already been written in the log. But first, we begin in East Texas, where a family kept a 450-pound Bengal tiger on their private property and did not survive the evening it stopped being manageable. It was March 15th, 2016, on a private rural property in Jasper County, East Texas, roughly 4 miles from the nearest paved road. Drexel Offen was 45, an unlicensed exotic animal dealer who had operated informally for over a decade. His wife Sareth, 42, managed the household and helped oversee the property's animal inventory. Their son, Colton, 19, handled the daily feeding routine. Their daughter, Bryn, 16, had grown up around the animals and assisted when needed. Olive was a 4-year-old male Bengal tiger the family had acquired through an informal network as a cub. By 2016, Olive weighed an estimated 450 pounds. The enclosure had been constructed from chain link fencing and steel tubing around 2013 and had not been upgraded since. Over the preceding year, Drexel had kept a handwritten behavioral log on the animal. The logs recorded escalating feeding aggression, fence lunging, and repeated strikes at a failing corner post. Drexel used temporary zip ties despite documenting the repair was inadequate. What makes it difficult is Drexel documented everything thoroughly, yet still relied on a temporary fix. On the evening of March 15th, the family moved through what neighbors described as their standard feeding and enclosure check routine. They had done it hundreds of times before. Investigators later determined that familiarity was a direct factor in why the compromised corner post had not been prioritized. Bengal tigers are among the largest land predators, with adult males weighing between 400 and 550 pounds. They can sprint over 35 miles per hour, making attacks almost impossible to avoid in confined spaces. Their hunting method ends with a powerful bite to the throat or neck. Captivity does not erase these instincts. Living around humans changes only the surroundings, not the tiger's natural predatory behavior. No witness survived to describe what occurred that evening, but investigators spent 2 days reconstructing the sequence from physical evidence, wound patterns, and the positions of the 4 bodies across 3 separate areas of the property. The lower corner post gave way at some point during the feeding routine, breaching the outer enclosure. Based on scrape marks in the soil near the breach point and the condition of the surrounding fence material, Olive had pushed through at speed. Drexel was found 6 feet from the breach, face down. The injuries to his upper back and neck were consistent with a strike from behind a pursuit knockdown, followed by a sustained bite at the back of the neck, which is the grip pattern a tiger uses on prey it has closed on from behind. The fatal neck compression caused rapid death. Medical findings showed Drexel had no opportunity to call for help or move after first contact. Sareth was found approximately 40 feet from the outer enclosure wall. The blood trail between the enclosure perimeter and where she was recovered indicated she had been running toward the main house. The attack pattern on her injuries was consistent with a lateral pursuit strike, a shoulder-height knockdown from the side that drove her to the ground before she reached the midpoint of the open yard, followed by a bite to the throat region. She had made it further than Drexel, which meant she had likely heard something and was already moving when Olive came through. Colton ran toward a locked shed but never reached it. His injuries were to the chest and shoulder. The outer wall of the shed showed impact marks, consistent with a body being driven against it with significant force before going to the ground. The knockdown had happened against the structure. He had been within a few feet of a door that would not have opened in time regardless. Bryn was found inside the feeding preparation structure with its door partially open. A cracked cell phone lay nearby. She had the greatest distance from the breach point and used that time to enter and reach for something. The attack occurred near the entrance, and she was unable to close the door behind her. Emergency responders secured the scene the next morning. Olive was euthanized, and investigators found no permit, inspections, secondary containment, or emergency plan. Safety failures were cited. All 4 Offen family members died on March 15th, 2016. I think about the log most of all with this one. It wasn't carelessness in the usual sense. He saw it coming in slow motion, he recorded it, and he kept moving toward it anyway. That is a quiet kind of tragedy that is hard to explain from the outside. While East Texas had claimed the entire Offen family, the private compounds of the United Arab Emirates would soon show that even an animal known since cubhood could reach a threshold that no number of uneventful years together would push back. It was June 22nd, 2015, at a walled private compound on the outskirts of Ras Al Khaimah in the northern United Arab Emirates. Khalid Al-Ruwaili was 49, a real estate investor who had kept exotic animals on his property for 8 years. The compound's primary animal at the time of the incident was a male African lion named Hakim, approximately 6 years old, and estimated at 380 pounds, acquired as a cub and raised entirely on the property. Faris, the compound's part-time caretaker, was 28. He had been at the property for roughly 2 years and had raised concerns about Hakim's behavior in a verbal report to Khalid several months prior. Hakim showed post-feeding redirecting behavior, turning toward Khalid instead of retreating, a known escalation in captive lions. Khalid acknowledged it, but did not change protocol, and by 2015 years of uneventful entries had dulled the warning in his judgment. On the afternoon of June 22nd, Khalid entered Hakim's enclosure alone to conduct what he had described to Faris minutes beforehand as a routine check. Faris remained outside the gate. African lions are apex predators, capable of reaching 50 miles per hour over short distances. Adult males typically weigh between 330 and 420 pounds. They attack by driving prey to the ground before applying a sustained crushing bite to the neck or head until resistance ends. In captivity, these hunting instincts remain intact. Redirecting behavior toward handlers after feeding is a recognized warning sign, even if the animal has never attacked before. According to Faris, Khalid had been inside the enclosure for approximately 2 minutes when Hakim moved. There was no preceding vocalization, no growl, no audible warning that Faris registered from his position outside the gate. The charge was direct and covered the distance in under 2 seconds. The knockdown strike caught Khalid across the chest and upper shoulder, the full mass of a 380-pound animal driving into him at speed, and he was off his feet before he could brace. He went down hard onto the enclosure floor. Hakim was on him before the impact had resolved. The lion drove his jaws toward the back of the neck and upper spine, the primary grip a lion uses on large downed prey, positioned to apply compression to the cervical region without the animal needing to reposition during the hold. Khalid's legs were moving in the first several seconds, and both hands were pressing against the lion's shoulders and face, trying to create separation. At 380 pounds bearing down from above, that resistance did not move the animal. Hakim tightened the grip, then repositioned his jaw, once pulling slightly higher toward the base of the skull, and held it there. Faris immediately began striking the outer fence structure with both hands. Then, with a water bucket he grabbed from beside the gate, shouting Khalid's name and throwing loose gravel toward the lion's flank and head, he moved laterally along the fence, trying to pull the animal's focus. Hakim did not disengage. Khalid's legs had stopped moving. Faris called his name twice more and got no response. He left the gate and ran toward the property's main building to locate a second worker. I think the hardest part is that Faris warned them, but nothing changed before it happened. By the time both men returned to the enclosure, Khalid was unresponsive. Hakim had moved to the far end of the space. Paramedics arrived about 25 minutes later and pronounced Khalid dead. Injuries centered on the upper body and neck. Authorities found missing safety documentation, transferred Hakim, and confirmed Khalid was 49 years old. While Ras Al Khaimah had taken Khalid Al-Ruwaili inside a compound he had walked into dozens of times before, the interior of Sulawesi would soon prove that the most dangerous animals are not always the ones you see coming. It was October 8th, 2017. At a rural homestead in the interior of Sulawesi Island, Indonesia, roughly 19 miles from the nearest town, Rizwan Hadipranoto was 54, a retired construction worker who had kept reptiles on and off for most of his adult life. His most significant animal at the time of the incident was a female reticulated python he called Kasim, approximately 22 feet in length and estimated at 210 pounds, which had been in his possession for 11 years. In the 3 weeks preceding October 8th, Kasim had not been fed. Rizwan operated a rotation-based feeding schedule he adjusted according to the snake's size and seasonal behavior. Neighbors described this as his consistent practice. He lived alone on the property, his wife having passed 4 years prior, and his interactions with the python were largely unobserved. His nearest neighbor, Surdianto, 61, had raised informal concerns about Qasim's growing size on more than one occasion over the years. Those conversations had not changed anything. On the morning of October 8th, Surdianto observed Rizwan entering the large wooden shed at the back of the property that housed the python's enclosure. He thought nothing of it. When midday came and Rizwan had not emerged, Surdianto crossed over to the property to check. Reticulated pythons are the world's longest snakes, with adults often exceeding 20 feet. They kill by constriction, tightening around prey until breathing and blood circulation stop. After extended periods without food, large pythons may enter a heightened feeding state, causing them to strike and wrap quickly around nearby warm bodies. Even 11 years of regular feeding cannot reliably override this instinctive response. Surdianto found the shed door latched from the outside. He called out and received no response. When he entered and his eyes adjusted to the interior, he understood within seconds what he was looking at and immediately backed out. Investigators reconstructed the likely sequence using enclosure evidence, Rizwan's position, and documented reticulated python behavior during a heightened feeding state. A python of Qasim's length strikes from a coiled or partially extended position, launching the forward third of the body toward the target and driving her recurved teeth in on contact to anchor a grip before the body begins looping forward. The recurved teeth point backward along the jaw once set. Pulling away from the bite deepens the wound rather than breaking free of it. The most probable point of initial contact was Rizwan's upper arm or torso as he moved toward the enclosure in the standard lean of a routine check. Once the teeth were anchored, Qasim's body would have moved forward within seconds, looping across his arms and torso in rapid successive coils. A 22-foot, 210-pound snake can place 3 to 4 full-body loops across a human torso before the person can generate any effective physical response. A reticulated python does not crush instantly. It tightens with each exhale, steadily reducing the next breath. The constriction responds to movement, and against 210 pounds of sustained pressure, escape becomes impossible. Respiratory failure under those conditions typically occurs within several minutes. The substrate disturbance on the enclosure floor was confined to a single area near the center of the space. The struggle, to whatever extent it occurred, had not moved far. The sequence had concluded long before midday. Qasim was in full constriction posture when Surdianto found them, her body looped around a human-shaped mass on the enclosure floor, her head resting still on top of the coils. I think 11 safe years created confidence, not safety. The routine never became less dangerous, only more familiar. The python was removed from the enclosure and transported to a wildlife facility in the regional capital. Rizwan Hadapranoto was confirmed dead at the scene. Investigators noted the 3-week feeding gap preceding the incident and the absence of a second person during enclosure entry as contributing factors. No permit for the animal was on file. Rizwan was 54 years old. While Sulawesi had claimed Rizwan Hadapranoto in the silence of a wooden shed, the villages of Cameroon would soon reveal that even an animal raised entirely by human hands could reach a point where those hands no longer carried any weight. It was August 3rd, 2014, at a private homestead on the edge of a village in the littoral region of Cameroon, approximately 37 miles from Douala. Celestin Mfumu was 47, a former logging contractor who had worked the interior forests of the region for over 15 years. Roughly 5 years before the incident, during a logging operation in the forest interior, a juvenile chimpanzee had been found orphaned. Celestin had brought it home. What began as something informal had, over 5 years, become a fixture of the household. Benny, an 8-year-old chimpanzee, lived in a fenced enclosure beside the home. Adeline, 44, warned of escalating aggression, but Celestin continued solo entries despite repeated destructive behavior. The warning signs were noticed, but Celestin believed his bond with the animal made them less relevant to him. On the morning of August 3rd, Adeline was inside the main house. Celestin entered the enclosure during what she described to investigators as a typical part of their morning. Adult chimpanzees are much stronger than humans, with upper body strength about 4 to 5 times greater. Their attacks are fast and sustained, combining powerful bites, gripping, and pulling that often target the face, hands, and arms. Research shows aggressive males rarely return to earlier behavior after reaching maturity. Benny's object throwing, loud vocalizations, and damage to his enclosure were all recognized warning signs of escalating aggression. Adeline reported hearing the disturbance begin shortly after Celestin entered not a single sound, but a sustained one that did not stop, the kind that told her immediately it was not a routine moment. She moved to the outer fence line. Benny had Celestin on the ground, near the center of the enclosure. The attack was not organized the way a predator's strike is organized. It was rapid and multi-directional. Benny moved between Celestin's hands, forearms, and face in fast alternating sequence, biting and releasing and repositioning without pause. The bite to Celestin's left forearm had already opened a deep wound by the time Adeline reached the fence. She could see Celestin's arms moving, trying to cover his face, and she could see Benny pulling those arms away from it, gripping at the wrist with both hands, and using his body weight to move the arm aside before going for the face again. She heard Celestin call out once, clearly. Then his voice changed into something she told investigators she could not describe accurately. She could not enter or reach him. She screamed his name while Benny did not disengage, then ran about 80 meters to a neighbor and returned with 2 men, and all 3 used long poles, constant noise, and shouting to drive Benny back before entering the enclosure and reaching Celestin. The injuries were multiple and severe. The bite to his left upper arm had torn through muscle to the bone. His face had sustained deep lacerations across the cheekbone and forehead. Both hands carried bite wounds, consistent with repeated defensive positioning. He had been trying to protect his face throughout the entire duration of the attack. He was conscious enough to be moved but could not speak clearly, and he lost coherence during the vehicle transit to the clinic 25 miles away. Celestin Mfumu died en route from injuries consistent with a chimpanzee attack. Wildlife officials were notified, Benny was removed to a sanctuary, and investigators found no permit or proper containment or emergency standards in place. I think Adeline saw the warning, but trust convinced the only decision maker to ignore it. While Cameroon had claimed Celestin Mfumu within his own fenced yard, the remote backcountry of British Columbia would soon show that even an animal taken in with genuine care could cross a line that goodwill alone was never going to hold back. It was May 19th, 2013, at a remote property in the Thompson-Okanagan region of British Columbia, approximately 18 miles from the nearest town. Tamsin Grulock was 37, a wildlife enthusiast who had been running an informal animal rehabilitation setup on her land for several years without provincial licensing. Her husband, Verdun, 41, worked as a heavy equipment operator and was off-site during the week, returning on weekends. Roughly 2 years before the incident, in an early spring thaw, a black bear cub had appeared on the property's perimeter, apparently separated from its mother. Tamsin had taken the cub in and named it Cadeau. By 2013, Cadeau is estimated at 270 pounds, a fully developing subadult male approaching the upper boundary of a critical behavioral transition. British Columbia regulation required any bear in human care to be transferred to a licensed rehabilitation facility. Tamsin had not made that transfer. She had also not reported the animal to provincial wildlife authorities at any point during the 2 years she had kept it. Throughout Cadeau's development, Tamsin maintained close contact, hand feeding, entering the enclosure, and structuring her routine around its needs, but instead of domestication, it created a food and contact association, steadily strengthening as Cadeau's physical power increased. On the morning of May 19th, Verdun left the property at 6 in the morning for a worksite assignment. Tamsin's routine was to feed the animals shortly after. She entered Cadeau's outdoor enclosure alone. North American black bears are the continent's most widespread bear species, with adult males weighing between 200 and 500 pounds. Wildlife research shows food-conditioned bears can lose the ability to reliably separate familiar people from food-related expectations. At 270 pounds, Cadeau was powerful enough to deliver a bite exceeding 600 pounds per square inch, making any direct attack extremely dangerous. The conservation officer investigation reconstructed the sequence using enclosure evidence, wound documentation, and Cadeau's behavioral history. Initial contact occurred near the gate before Tamsin moved far inside. The positioning matched a direct committed predatory approach seen in food-conditioned bears. A 270-pound bear driving forward at close range would have made full contact before Tamsin could process the animal's intent. The knockdown would have been immediate. Medical findings showed a continuous attack after the initial knockdown, with repeated high-force bites to the upper body and neck, and no sign of stopping or disengagement. The outer gate was found open when Verdon arrived, positioned as if Tamsin had not had time to close it after entering. Kato was at the far end of the enclosure when Verdon arrived. The animal was calm. Verdon exited immediately and contacted emergency services from the property's landline. Emergency services and conservation officers arrived approximately 45 minutes after the call. Kato was euthanized at the scene. Tamsin Grulock was pronounced dead inside the enclosure. She was 37 years old. Investigators confirmed no permit or notification had ever been filed. They concluded prolonged food conditioning erased Kato's distinction between Tamsin and food. Verdon was cleared of involvement. I think Tamsin's greatest act of care became the tragedy she never imagined, and that's impossible to neatly explain. While British Columbia had taken Tamsin Grulock on a quiet weekday morning, the Northern Territory of Australia would demonstrate that a saltwater crocodile does not need to pursue you. It only needs to wait for the distance to close on its own. It was February 7th, 2018, near Katherine in the Northern Territory, Australia, where temperatures that morning had already climbed past 95 degrees Fahrenheit before 9 o'clock. Bram Holleran was 57, a former earthworks contractor who had settled in the Northern Territory in the early 90s and held a wildlife exhibit license for several years. His property contained a concrete and steel enclosure he had largely constructed himself, housing a single saltwater crocodile, a male approximately 14 feet in length and estimated at just over 900 pounds, named Strop. Bram had expanded and modified the enclosure over several years as Strop grew. The structure included an internal partition, a heavy steel gate mechanism that allowed Bram to divide Strop into a smaller holding section during feeding and maintenance. That partition was the only thing that made solo enclosure work practical without a second trained handler on site. A property inspection carried out 8 months before the incident had flagged the gate mechanism directly. The inspector documented visible wear on the locking assembly and recommended replacement in the formal report. Bram signed the acknowledgement. The gate had not been replaced in the 8 months that followed. I think the hardest part is that the failed equipment had been identified 8 months earlier, yet nothing was ever changed. Saltwater crocodiles are the largest living reptiles, with big males exceeding 17 feet and 1,200 pounds. They are ambush predators, staying motionless until striking with explosive speed and an immediate jaw lock. They often follow with a powerful death roll, using their body to tear tissue and overwhelm prey. In close quarters, a large crocodile in the absence of a secure barrier can turn a single mistake into a fatal encounter. The neighboring property worker described hearing 2 sounds in sequence from the direction of Bram's enclosure. The first was a sharp mechanical report which investigators later confirmed matched the internal gate locking assembly giving way. The second sound was a wet percussive impact from the direction of the water feature at the enclosure's center. She initially thought something had fallen. When the sounds that followed made the situation clear, she contacted emergency services without approaching the fence line again. Investigators reconstructed the attack sequence from evidence on the enclosure floor, the condition of the gate mechanism, and the physical evidence at and around the water feature. The locking assembly had failed during the feeding sequence, giving Strop access to the main enclosure area while Bram was still working inside it. A saltwater crocodile of Strop's size does not move toward prey from distance. It closes from absolute stillness. The strike itself is an explosive, full-body lunge from a stationary position that covers the space to a target in a fraction of a second. Whatever Bram's position in the enclosure when Strop cleared the gate, the time between the animal moving and first contact would have been too short to produce a directed response. The jaw closing on contact at over 3,000 pounds of force per square inch meant that wherever that first grip landed limb, torso, any part of a human body, the physical result was immediate and structurally irreversible. The crocodile's death roll continued through multiple rotations. Drag marks showed the attack move from the water's edge, with each rotation causing greater damage. No functioning barrier existed to interrupt the attack. Emergency responders arrived about 50 minutes later. The review confirmed the gate failed at the exact point identified 8 months earlier, making the incident preventable. Bram Holleran was 57 years old. While Catherine had claimed Bram Holleran through a maintenance failure that had been documented and then set aside, the Limpopo Lowveld of South Africa would prove that even the most experienced handler working with an animal raised in their own care could not predict what a familiar morning might ask of them. It was November 12th, 2015, at a private captive breeding facility in the Limpopo province of South Africa, approximately 19 miles from the Botswana border. Thulani Gishumisa was 43, a wildlife handler and co-owner of a small, big cat breeding and education operation that had been running for 7 years. The facility maintained several enclosures, including one housing a 3-year-old female African leopard named Saba, an animal Thulani had been directly involved in raising since her first weeks on the property. Saba had been born from the facility's breeding stock and had undergone regular, structured human contact from a very early age. The facility used her for occasional private educational programs, during which she was managed on a lead in a controlled outdoor setting. Thulani, the primary handler, had the most direct contact with Saba, while his assistant Dion, 29, had limited experience with her. In the 3 weeks before November 12th, Saba entered estrus, showing increased territoriality, vocalization, and reactivity. Thulani documented this and reduced Dion's proximity, but continued his own solo enclosure entries. I think years of routine made the documented risk easier to overlook. Familiar habits can quietly outweigh safety principles in everyday decisions. On the morning of November 12th, Dion had been assigned to a section of the facility away from Saba's enclosure. Thulani entered alone. African leopards are highly adaptable predators. Adult females weigh between 60 and 130 pounds and can carry prey heavier than themselves into trees. Their attacks are fast, close, and typically involve maintaining a powerful bite. In captivity, females in estrus may approach familiar handlers more often, but experts warn that recognition does not override instinct. Hormonal changes can reduce restraint, making even trusted handlers vulnerable to sudden aggression. Dion heard the disturbance approximately 10 minutes after Thulani had entered the enclosure, a short, sharp sound, then something sustained that he recognized immediately as wrong. He moved to the outer fence line. Saba had Thulani down near the center of the enclosure floor. A leopard attack does not have the open geometry of a lion charge. It begins from close range and low, often faster than a person can initiate a response, and the animal's drive is to hold the grip rather than let it go. Saba's jaws were set at the upper body and neck. She had not released. Thulani's right arm was pressed against the animal's chest, and his body was partially turned, positioning consistent with someone attempting to create lateral distance after being brought to the ground. A female African leopard generates enough jaw compression and body torque to hold a prone adult male against effort to push free, and Saba's instinct under those conditions was to maintain the bite. She was not releasing and repositioning, she was holding. Dion grabbed a long maintenance pole from outside the gate and began striking the outer fence structure in rapid succession, moving laterally along the fence line as he did it, making himself loud and directionally unpredictable rather than static. Saba's head came up once toward the sound. She did not release. Dion continued, increasing force on the fence and volume of voice, sustaining the pressure without pause. After approximately 90 seconds of continuous noise and movement, Saba released her grip and moved to the far end of the enclosure. Dion waited several seconds until she had created clear distance, then entered through the gate and crossed the enclosure floor to reach Thulani. The injuries to the upper body and neck were consistent with a sustained leopard attack, multiple deep bite compressions to the right shoulder and neck, rather than a single wound, the kind of injury pattern produced by a grip that was held and incrementally repositioned rather than applied once and released. Thulani's defensive hand injuries showed he fought back. Dion found him unresponsive, called his name once, received no response, and immediately contacted emergency services. Paramedics arrived about 35 minutes later. Thulani, 43, was pronounced dead. Review found no second handler. Solo entry continued despite documented estrus, and national authorities reviewed procedures. I think Thulani recognized the danger, documented it, yet still followed the familiar route alone. That makes this tragedy especially difficult. If you like today's episode, go ahead and hit that like button and go ahead and make sure to subscribe. Come on, you know you want to. We got videos coming out every other day. We'll see you next time.